I'm coming to you from the lands of Treaty 7. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all the people who make their homes on the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So a little bit about our speakers today. We have the pleasure of having a panel of speakers at this session. There will be 5 people in total. You'll be hearing from Jennifer Willinga, Dr. Christy Elaine, Dr. Joseph Gurgis, Dr. Laura Meisner, and Dr. Eric McIntosh. Now, Jennifer Willinga is a professor here at Royal Roads of Communication and Culture, an organizational development researcher and consultant with a focus on sport leadership. And for the session today, theoretical and research perspectives on culture and sport. The notes include academics have highlighted the influence and perpetuation of colonial, capitalistic, and imperialistic principles in sport in Canada. Currently, our sports system is built on a power imbalance, and unless we challenge, expose, and change these governing principles, the beat goes on. Researchers have produced several articles, presentations, and reports teasing out these issues and contributing to cultural factors. But what are the actual avenues for change, and how do we clean up the restructure Canadian sport to prevent abuse of power and achieve sport Canadians want? With that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Wow, thanks so much, Kim. I really appreciated you sharing that overview. We don't tend to remind people of what the webinar is about when we run these. And I'm very appreciative to the School of Communication and Culture, particularly the BA programs, for allowing our little group to join in with the larger conference, because typically this is a standalone webinar series called Sport, Leadership, and Social Change. And so it's really great to be part of the bigger conference and have so many attendees. This has got to be a record for us. Welcome. And welcome to our panelists. We've got Christy and Eric and Joseph. They've been introduced a little bit. We'll give them lots of time to share a little bit more about the work that they do within their roles. Laura hasn't arrived yet. I'm assuming something might have, oh, there she is. Okay, good. So no problem. We'll slide her in. I'm just going to start with a little bit of a preamble about the webinar, little bit of background and a short intro, and then we'll dive right in. This will be a conversation, and I want to welcome people to feel free to post your questions in the chat. It's totally great. I'll be watching and monitoring, and we'll try and weave those comments and questions into our discussion as we usually do within this series. So thanks again. And I too am coming to you from the lands of the Lekwungen and Kusepsin First Nations. Though we are maybe perhaps not directly responsible for the harms inflicted over centuries in Canada, we do need to bear the responsibility of working hard to acknowledge the truth of the past, work to heal some of the damage that was done, and also work to be intentional about bringing into reconciliation, reconcile our values with our practice, equity, peace, justice. We all need to work hard to make sure that we're doing better going forward. And that's really relevant to the work we're talking about today within the sport system. And how do we build that cultural integrity, walking the talk, living our values and our practice, our processes, our structures. This is a multi-part series. I really felt that, we're talking about culture so much. It's coming up so much within the discourse around sport in Canada right now. And so I wanted to look at it from multiple perspectives. And this session, of course, will be coming at it from a theoretical or research perspective. All of our guests are doing research in the area. And so I'll give them lots of time to talk about that. And we also had some practitioners. We've actually met with some NSOs. We've got athletes and activists coming in next. And really been a great conversation all around. We partner with sport in so many ways. We don't have our own sports teams here at Royal Roads, although I always joke that we could have the Cougars. We do have Cougars on campus, and our peacock is a beautiful mascot, reminding us of how unique we all are. But we do partner with athletes through our flexible admission. We acknowledge the work that they've done in their international training and competition professional experience. We acknowledge that like we do with any professional experience for credit to our programs. We really, I think, reflect a lot of the truths that are in sport across our campus, across our programs. We're constantly learning from the environment that stares us in the face, just like we do within sport. We are conscious of the importance of diversity at railroads, just like sport teaches us to, I always think of the bridge as a good pass. It really relies on both the receiver and the passer, right? It's both people's responsibility. And in much the same way, communication functions that way, and any kind of advancement we seek through our community or organizations really hinges on, obviously, our whole survival hinges on diversity. I'm really proud of the work that sport participants do to leverage their platform. And we get behind that at Railroads as well. We believe in social change, positive social change, and being courageous in fostering transformational change in society. And man, we see it in sport. It's got one of the biggest platforms, I think, in the world, biggest impact, biggest reach. It's the most watched, participated in human endeavor in the world. And so many people have recognized that and have been leveraged it to work for values like peace, equity, and inclusion. And our programs reflect very similar endeavors that you see people pursuing through sport as well. We also partner with different organizations, and we offer some programs that relate to sport as well. Sport leadership, governance, sport for society. We work with Game Plan to help athletes find our programs and continue their education as they're competing, or shortly after when they decide to shift out of their sport career into something else. We partner with organizations like CFL, and lots of my research is partnered with. I usually use a SHRC Partnership Engage grant to work with a sport organization and help them do some applied research. And really, that's how this whole webinar series was born. The idea of sport, leadership, and social change. How can we better leverage the platform of sport to foster positive social change, both through sport, but within sport? We're really seeing some difficult crises. Recently, I think I had the most media requests of my life around an article on Hockey Canada scandal recently. It's really disturbing. So today we're going to tackle, how do we bring our practice back into alignment with the values we uphold in Canada, in the world, as people, but through sport, and what sport possesses, I think, inherently, and what it can communicate at its best. So introducing Laura Meisner from Western University, professor and director of the School of Kinesiology, and really focusing on sport and events and how these can be used as instruments for social change, access, and inclusion. Eric McIntosh, welcome, from the University of Ottawa, professor of sport management. And I listened to Eric's work recently in partnership with another friend, Alison Doherty, on too much of a good thing in sports. So that'll be interesting to dive in today. I was lucky enough to moderate a panel with some of these individuals, including Joseph Gerges, who's from the Ontario Tech University, teaching professor, but I really encourage you to find his dissertation, which combines 3 different studies with different perspectives on safeguarding in sport. And I always want to press Joseph to talk more about his ideas around governance, because I really see that as a big lever for change in sport as well. And so great to meet Christy Allen. You and I have not met, but I really love listening to your podcast and your work on hockey. And in particular, although you're doing great work in all sorts of different areas, Canada Research Chair in Physical, Cultural, and Social Life at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick. So reminding everybody, feel free to pose questions in the chat. Here's some contact information. You can find all of our guests on various social media channels. And we're looking toward our next episode will be with athletes and activists. That's coming up. We're going to be talking about specifically power dynamics next month. I believe it's March 14th. So that's it from me, and welcome to our guests. Let's dive in. We have all sorts of great questions lined up, but I want to start by asking you each, tell us a little bit about your relationship with sport. So perhaps we can start with Christy, and then I'll just tap each of you to go around the circle here. But Christy, your relationship with sport, because I know you have a kind of unique relationship.
Well, yeah, I think I came to study sport through my mom. I grew up in a working class family. My mother was a huge hockey fan, and we spent a lot of time at the rink watching hockey. I grew up in a big CHL city, and for the last, I guess, almost now 2 decades, I've kind of channeled that into an examination of hockey culture, masculinities, and my work really sits at the intersections of masculinity, national identity in the sport of hockey. I've been looking at the CHL, transnational labor migration from Eastern Europe to the Canadian Hockey League, and then grew that work to look at the experiences of CHL athletes and the ways that they produce particular forms of masculinity. And more recently, I've left that a little bit behind and have looked at what old men's hockey can tell us about how to do hockey well today.
Thank you. Yeah, that one's so interesting. And so many beautiful nuggets, right? Of what can be possible. So much good learning. And I like how you just call it old man hockey, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them are quite old. Yeah.
I'm definitely old man rowing now. Thank you. And Joseph.
Yeah, I would say that my current relationship with sport is one that I am actively trying to mend. I always joke with my students that my departure from high performance sport was sort of like a bad breakup. And unfortunately, I think like many sport researchers, we have some type of relation with sport as a practitioner or a participant of sport. I was a high performance baseball player, played for over 15 years, and uh, didn't leave necessarily on the best of terms after experiencing a lot of different types of harm, between discrimination and what I come to understand today as being either neglectful or emotionally abusive. And it was really my transition into research and academia that allowed me to start bending my relationship with sport, where I can make sense of my experiences and realize that it wasn't necessarily a reflection of me as an individual, but rather, various power imbalances and, various imperfect forms of self-regulation within sport that consequently led to some of these harmful experiences that I've endured and some of my peers have endured as well. And so with that, my commitment to sport now as a researcher is really exploring how we can make sport essentially a more safe and inclusive and accessible space for different populations. And so I find myself in two spaces, one around this emerging field of safe sport and everything it encompasses, and the second being coach development, recognizing that coaches are key leaders in advancing a space where we can safeguard different participants from harm. And within both those areas, focusing a lot on the experiences of equity denied populations, whether it's the experiences of Indigenous coaches, like I've done with my postdoc out east, or currently looking at some of the experiences of other marginalized identities within the context of sport.
And on that note, I'm going to go to Laura because I think her work builds so beautifully on that final statement.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess my early involvement in sport was as a high performance gymnast, and I was of an era where I spent close to 40 hours a week training in the gym, and loved every moment of it at the time. Didn't think anything or have a chance to really reflect on what that meant. So I had wonderful experiences in my mind of that time. And when I left sport, interesting that I didn't know what to do. Couldn't do anything else. I didn't know how to do any. And I eventually became a judge and a coach also in the sport, where I began really to see some of these challenges and things that Joseph spoke about. And I tried to make change from within, or at least I thought I could. And I felt very silenced. Even someone who had an education, was getting an education in space, and I did research in my master's degree around child protection policy in youth sport, and tried to voice my perspectives within the community that we needed change. We needed other things to be done to protect children in those spaces. And I didn't get anywhere. And so, unfortunately, I left as well, that particular space. And I maybe like Christy, and I like that term, old men's hockey, because I'm now an old lady skier, climber, you name it. I do that instead. And so found a passion, and then reinvested myself in recreational sport as an adult, and have really come to love it again. And so the work that I do really is about making sure that we foster spaces where everyone can fall in love with sport. And so, for me, that's really such an important part of what I do and why I do what I do.
It's such an interesting concept. I've wrestled with why do I want people to love it like I do? I don't know why, but I'm so in love with it. And I guess I want to share that positive experience. But same, you know, like Joseph, really, I had a great experience, but then I watched my kids all have kind of really heartbreaking experiences, and you just want to fix it. Thank you for sharing. And there's a couple notes in the chat about that too. Just thank you for sharing those experiences and opening up. And Eric.
Good afternoon. So I guess my journey into sport, like most people here, probably involved participating. I grew up in a very rural community, and hockey and baseball were my two outlets for sport. So team sport was my foray into sport. Later playing rugby in high school. And throughout my experiences in these communities, and my team involvement, I saw and witnessed and was privy to a lot of things I didn't like about sport. But I didn't think much about it until I really started entering, I think, into sport research much later as an academic. And so I've been working with some colleagues for, I guess, the last 3 years or so now, looking at culture. My dissertation was on organizational culture. And I came to this safe sport world more so because I was annoyed at how people discussed culture and their lack of understanding of the nuances and complexity of the word than any other reason. And I've been immersed in this world now, trying to understand what our high performance system is up against, much historical issues that I'm sure we'll talk about today, and some fairly knee-jerk reactions that I think are not really proving their worth quite yet and may not prove their worth. So I look forward to maybe talking about some of that stuff.
Go for it. Let's start there, because you see, and that is, you know, one of the first questions. Let's talk a bit about culture. You know, it is a word that's being thrown around a lot, but I too feel a frustration. I work in the School of Communication and Culture. The two are inextricably linked. And of course, the people in this conference are very concerned with communication and ethical communication, but they all relate, of course. And so let's talk about culture in sport, and I mean writ large, but in Canada. Why don't you start, Eric, and talk a bit about what you try to focus on, or what you see some of these initiatives as, how they might be questionable.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, my principal grounding is looking at the athlete viewpoint first and foremost as being central to this cultural discourse that we're having. But of course, there's many things. There's the policies that are being implemented. There's the structure, the government funding. There's the traditional norms of how coaching happens. There's many things that we can talk about here. My grounding in this really is trying to understand the athlete point of view. And the simple rationale is they're the ones that most often suffer the forms of maltreatment that have caused the discussion to be amplified. And so acknowledging that their space, I think, is kind of the key component, at least for me, when we address change, is the first step in understanding what the culture is. And they've got multi-layered experiences throughout the sports system. So I start there, and and there's many other, obviously, critical areas, mechanisms that are being formed, as you're probably well aware, the government response to the crises, the history of the winning at all cost attitude, and how that has transferred over into the spaces that athletes suffer maltreatment. But this is the high performance sector, right? I mean, where I'm focused at, and I think most of the issues lie underneath that pinnacle of the pyramid, where most of the abuse is happening.
Right, and we can't forget that. And I'm glad you raised that, because I think we really do need to think about sport in general, whether it's, you know, beer league to pro league, little wee Timbits running around chasing a little soccer ball. It's all sport, and we can't forget that. I think we have started to a little bit over the years in Canada, that sport is only for the Olympics, you know, and you start to see it trickle down to these little kids that if they're not going, I had a kid once that I coached who said to me, I don't know if I should row. Neither of my parents are Olympians. And I thought, what has happened? What have we done? crazy. All right. So thinking more broadly, and what are the seeds? Why is this happening? Where does this come from? Ultimately, crisis around harm. What is culture at its real root? How does it start?
Do you want me to
Sure.
address that?
Or actually, I
I
can
yeah.
point to Christy here, because I know, Christy, you're thinking about the myth of Canada too, with this, where it's really come from or something.
Yeah, I think what I really like of Eric's explanation is that there's not a culture, right? There are many cultures. And I think in the debates, particularly around the Hockey Canada debates, we've talked about hockey culture as if it's one monolithic thing. And I think it's really important, as we're pointing out here, to think about the culture of hockey from my old guys is quite a bit different than the culture of hockey in the Canadian Hockey League, or the culture of hockey in men and boys elite level hockey that's primarily played by these seemingly straight white men. And we have to, I think, pinpoint where the harm is coming from if we're actually going to take a stab at changing that. And for me, when I think about this and I think about elite level hockey in Canada, we can see that the culture of hockey, the hockey we care about, the hockey played by, the hockey we see on TV, the elite level hockey, men and boys hockey, has these deep colonial roots, that it's has a system of violence that goes back to colonization, to the founding of Canada, to this notion that Canada was founded by settlers. It was terra nullius when people arrived, the erasure of Indigenous identities from the roots of hockey as a game, and that these forms of violence have sort of built upon one another, creating a culture of violence that we see today, that these things are deeply interconnected. And until we kind of pull at the threads and start to parse that out, I think it's really hard to make change. The violence that the Hockey Canada scandal has made so apparent is violence from players to, the community, to women in our communities. But there's also player to player violence, coach to player violence, and that all of these, there's acts of colonial violence happening in elite level hockey. You can look at some of the stuff going on in the prairies, the erasure of Indigenous teams from, AAA hockey in Manitoba, Saskatchewan. So I think it's really important. I like that Eric's kind of saying we need to talk about this. Not all cultures are problematic. And I think if we want to think about changing culture, that we might want to take lessons from some of these things some of these institutions that are maybe not front and center, while being attentive to the kind of historical legacies that produce cultures that are deeply, deeply troubling.
And I'm going to ask the guests now, let's try and create a little more of a flow with our conversation. So if you have something to say, if you want to build on to what anybody else is saying, I prefer it if I'm talking less and you're all talking more and building off of one another. But one way to do that and helps me as a moderator is just turn your mic on, and then I know you've got something. And if a couple, I can just, moderate, then that's easy for me. Yes, pinpointing the problematic seeds of problematic cultures. Where are they? Where does the harm derive? So a kind of colonial mindset. Tough if we're just allowing this to still be that underlying assumption governing how we act in our country. And we still do. Right? Yeah. Okay. What else? Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking more as really drawing on some of the work that Eric's done around this idea of where culture derives from, like those critical pieces that we use around language and customs and codes that become so institutionalized and then are transmitted through our various social learning processes, as Christy's work really demonstrates, is part of what we have to really begin to pull apart more. Is that part of the challenge with this idea of these various cultures is there is so many distinctions and so many different things, and so deeply embedded in what we know and understand about our sporting practices, the environments that we are working and playing within. And I just noticed someone in the chat talking about, you just listen to your coach and you do what you're told, because that's, again, a custom that we many of us grew up with as part of a ritual and a language that it's embedded within us to respect others, respect those in power, respect those with those particular positions, that we haven't really disrupted some of those issues in those cultural practices, so that we can begin to understand them and pull them apart more than we have. We sort of talk about this blanket notion of a culture within the sport and changing that culture, but there's so many layers to that and so many different things that go into doing that. That's the complexity. I get asked that a lot. And I know, Jennifer, you've been asked that question many times. You just said all those media interviews. Well, how do we change that culture? As if there's some magic thing that's just going to shift it. But it's so complex.
It starts with pinpointing, right? What's at the root so that we can see it and call it out a little more. And then we can start shifting some of the mechanisms, the structures. Joseph.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges when we're talking about shifting or changing culture is also understanding that with that comes shifting people's value system or beliefs about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, what's acceptable and unacceptable, or moral and immoral. The challenge behind that is that, when we're talking about values being such a subjective system of governing sport, whose values take precedence and which one should we look to inform the advancement of what is considered the appropriate culture or the safe sport culture. And so, when you look at the context of, let's say, hockey, I always, question, what would happen to the culture of hockey if all of a sudden fighting was eliminated at the professional level? Would it make us, much money as it did? Would it have the same type of fans or attraction? Would it attract different people into the sport itself? And it really comes down to, I think, what people value out of that particular, experience of, watching two hockey players drop the gloves and fight, or what people accept as being the overall purpose of just participation generally. And so I think the challenge really with shifting culture is understanding how do we change people's perspectives, or how do we sort of operate in a space where there's not competing values that are now, creating different norms of what's appropriate and inappropriate within sport. And how we do that, I think, probably a conversation we'll continue to have and engage in today. But I think that's one of the seeds that can be positively contributing to good culture, but it also can be one of those seeds of culture that are challenging and can create or reproduce sort of toxic culture that we've seen within the context of sport.
Yeah, I agree. Especially like I'm thinking about some of the values that are coming out from the research that we're working on, and maybe some of the obvious ones are ones we can talk about, like how much we place a value of people's motivation and drive to excel and to be great and to win, and excellence, and like all these things that we hold as important across probably every sport. Like I don't think it's just a sport. I think we and asking ourselves why, like to what detriment do we have to go so hard all the time, and at what cost is it happening to the people that are participating in sport. And I think that's maybe where we see a lot of the problems happening with what we're considering unsafe or maltreatment, is that there's physical and mental and much different forms of both of those, where people are suffering at the root cause of winning, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And that's where this conversation maybe needs to go, is like, are we emphasizing the right things in our system?
Well, and the acceptance that as long as we're winning, then all this other stuff is okay somehow, that it excuses abusive language or exclusionary practices or violence. It's been interesting reading articles written within the health sector where we excuse, but he's a good doctor or she's a good doctor, even though she's a narcissist or really abusive in terms of their language use in the setting. But can you be in an endeavor that's for humanity, that's in service of human development? So we accept violence somehow. That's a problematic seed. But also this idea of winning at all costs, that winning is the priority, kind of like capitalism, right? If we say, well, money is priority, winning is priority in sport. So these are two very problematic seeds. How do we What do we do about those? Go ahead, Eric.
Oh, nobody else wants to jump in on this one. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a reframe, to be honest with you. To me, it's looking more at the process of what we're doing as opposed to the outcome only, and emphasizing, the learning development that can happen, and the process towards excellence. I don't think they operate in a vacuum though either. Like, there's no reason you can't have excellence and winning in a safe manner. It's just like what we've come to accept is part of the issue. Like, we need to really look in the mirror and say, what are we okay with? What behaviors are we okay with? And I was thinking about this as we led up to today, and what that means in the real world. I should have said this earlier. Like, I'm a volunteer in sport. My sons both play different sports, and I volunteer in different capacities. And if I see something or hear something, what will I do to try to intervene? And I'm not just saying like the greater me, I'm thinking everybody else in this. Where do you turn? What do you do to aid people that need help, that are vulnerable, and that don't have the voice or the wherewithal to know where to go? And it's a multi-tiered challenge, and this is operating in the grassroots structure. But if we're going to create a culture change, the focus really needs to be there. And I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn here, or if we're going to get to this, but I don't think it's coming down from the NSOs to the various jurisdictions where sport happens, and that's the big concern I have at the moment, where we're at.
I was just going to say, Joseph, I know you want to talk about this sort of more universal approach. Go for it.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Eric, completely. I don't think it's coming from the NSOs, but I would look even higher and say I don't fully feel convicted that it's really coming from Sport Canada, outside of the fact that there's been so many cases of harm that you have no option but to respond, right? The things we're dealing with today, let's be real, have existed for decades. And there's been scholars who've talked about this from, the 1980s and prior to that. And so, anyone who looks at Hockey Canada says, wow, what a shocker. There's no shocker to that. The only, shocker to Sport Canada is that they got caught, right? Dropping the ball in terms of implementing the appropriate safeguards and holding people accountable effectively. I think there's been some progress, forced progress, with the implementation of different safeguards between education, OSIC, policies and whatnot to facilitate this change in culture. But Jennifer, you said it correctly. If you think of sport as a corporation, and the fact that within this corporeal economy, it's all about making money, I wonder if people feel convinced enough that it's necessary to change culture. Is it necessary enough to change, certain norms within sport that celebrate violence and aggression? And unless you change people's perspective and convince them otherwise that, you can still obtain excellence without, sacrificing one's wellness. And that's why, and we'll probably talk about this shortly, I'll bring it up somehow, the whole concept around safeguarding being the appropriate framework to reconsider the culture of sport within Canada. And this is something that has been successful in the UK, that allows us to recognize it's important to prevent maltreatment, prevent impairment, but also provide safe and effective care. And doing all of that, we achieve the best possible outcomes. You can achieve winning while simultaneously ensuring that you're protecting people from harm. That culture is what I consider the ideal of sport. Getting there, I'm not fully convinced that we are in a position across the institution, from our governing bodies to NSOs and all the way down, to really commit to the efforts to change and transition to that.
So much to talk about, hey, and the will to change, and there isn't that much of a motivation because there's so much fear of losing other things. Laura.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Joseph's comments about there needs to be this, that there has to be this broader shift in that change, because I mean, Christy mentioned it early on, and in some of the sports, there's these deep colonial roots and where that culture comes from. But I also would argue that I do think that there is some very deeply embedded responsibility of our national sports system, because it was founded upon the government involvement of creating excellence at all costs. And if you go back and look at even some of the early policy documents that started in the 30s and the 50s and 60s, and then again, in pursuit of excellence, the 1970s document, then again I mean, you go on, these documents really situate our sort of national identity. If we're not succeeding on the international scene, however we get there, then we're not successful at all. We're not doing well as a nation somehow. And so, you know, I do think that there is a lot of onus put on that historical policy government involvement in driving that system. And when we weren't successful at games, you know, being known internationally as the only host that never won an Olympic medal, and then suddenly we have new governing bodies in place, and we have new policies in place with floods of money going in, and coaches being brought in from countries around the world, regardless of what whether the values matched on to what we thought our system might be about. That really changed it, and we didn't seem to care then. And so I'm not yet persuaded that we care enough and that people at the top care enough now to make that shift, because that language, that context of that is still so deeply embedded in our governance, in our policies, in the things that guide all levels of our sports system, that while I'm hopeful that we're making change, and I'd love to say that, I think that is so deeply embedded in what exists within our system. I don't know how we pull that entirely apart.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, you know, I'm hearing education, I'm hearing, you know, compelling athletes to be able to speak out. But when I actually speak to athletes themselves, the education is constantly undermined, at least in the misogynistic world of men's elite level hockey. They've been doing these education programs. Anti-sexual violence training has existed in the Canadian Hockey League for decades. This is not new. I mean, they may have revamped the program and rolled it out as something new now in light of the Hockey Canada scandal, but it's not a new program. And what you have every year is a coach and management who stands up and says, you've got to protect yourselves against vicious women who are coming after your career. And to do that, you have to do this checklist and attend this program. This is not, you know, good education. And unless, you know, what really I think frustrates me is that we're not actually dealing with coaches, and we're not doing this in a way that really suggests that we want change. Changing the board at Hockey Canada doesn't produce a new sports system. You know, you have the same coaches and managers and people training our youth that have been through these systems, that have been trained in how to produce these systems, who come back generation after generation and train the next generation of young athletes in the same culture, the cultures of silence, the cultures of misogyny, the cultures of homophobia, and a culture of elitism. And because it's focused on, you know, obtaining something that's so precious, we produce these kind of these cultures of sameness where it's impossible to even speak out against the violence that we see. I mean, it's quite astounding that we have 2 accusations of gang rape where nobody said anything in the Canadian Hockey League. That's remarkable that you could carry such a grotesque and troubling secret. Like, not only, you know, for folks who didn't even participate, this was kept secret. And I think that we need to think about how those cultures are produced. It's one thing, you know, as educators, we can produce these beautiful and you know, potentially transformative education packages. We can roll them out to these teams. But if the coach tells their players, their athletes, that they're garbage from the beginning, we're not going to be able to actually make the kind of transformation. I want to be positive and optimistic, but some days I find it, you know, deeply troubling.
Hopeless at times. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, like, there's so many different industries and realms where you know, sexual harassment and you know, various abuses are swept under the rug, right? To protect the corporate entity and the reputation of the organization. You know, and it's happened in sport, as we're aware, and it's happening in other places too. And it kind of just begs the larger question of what's wrong with people, you know, not just in sport, but just writ large. But I was thinking about the education piece, and I just want to go back to it for a second, because it occurred to me that it seems like we wave education as the magic wand. Let's take a workshop and a seminar, and no offense to today's seminar, because this is a great conversation, but you know, it's one more educational piece in the larger puzzle that we're asking people to try to put together. And it's equally difficult in a sports setting where most of these people are volunteers, and we're asking them to do more and more and more and more. And I think they take it kind of a tongue-in-cheek well, let's just check this box and get on with it because it's a government funding initiative and everybody has to be trained in this way. And it's an issue, actually. It's one of the issues we have to figure out, because it can be an answer, but is it an answer? And I speak to this more so from, hearing athletes tell me, like, at times they don't even know what's going on about safe sport. They just take the seminar at the start of the year and that's it, and check the box. And so we need to ask ourselves, is it effective even? Is this the right approach?
Absolutely. I want to get back to this idea of a kind of a primitive, I feel like it's a primitive mindset in Canada towards sport of, winning at all costs, of, oh my God, we're the embarrassment that we didn't win at our own Olympics. Like, couldn't we have rationalized that a little bit, or linked it to other values, or just been a little more, comprehensive in our thinking? The secrecy, the lack of safety, the incestuousness of the actual sport community. It's really hard to break in. If you're in, you got to be very careful. You're going to get booted out. And I think that all just ties in with some of these really problematic. However, also lots of great sport happening out there. A lot of great experiences, and many of us have had those. What do we do about this idea of Canada only caring about the medals? Pursuit of excellence got to be at the, at least somewhere in the medal table, even though it makes no sense whatsoever. What can we do about that? This very, primitive mindset about sport. Joseph.
I think it's a great question. I think it's been something that scholars have been wrestling with for decades, given that we're talking about the same issues in Canada that we've, been discussing since, Sheldon Kennedy's experiences of sexual violence, right? I think we need a leader who is radical enough to challenge the status quo of sport and ensure that the reproduction of sport experiences are not reflective of what we've done in the past. There is so much evidence over time to show how sport has adopted this very colonial and hypermasculine structure, and we're continuously reproducing those. And you can, cover it up with education policy to suggest otherwise, but the way that sport is operationalized and actually implemented still reinforce these particular values. And we see that at the end of the day, that elite sport continues to be the focus. That's why, Sport Canada's policy on Aboriginal people in sport came out, 2005? And the Sport Canada policy on disability came out in 2006. And there's no reflection or no consideration of any of the changes. We see recent research showing that NSOs have failed to respond to the calls to action. And so at the end of the day, all of these little social injustice or social justice safeguards and endeavors between OSIC and education and policy, it's a band-aid approach, because at the end of the day, after the Larry Nassar case, was exposed, everyone started talking about and hopping on the safe sport bandwagon as if this is something that needs to immediately and urgently be dealt with. But again, these problems have always existed. And when you look at, for example, in 1992, when Sport Canada put together a task force to examine sport policy, and one of the things that came out of that task force in the report, Sport the Way Ahead, was to say that sport is very much organized through this elitist structure, and that needs to be less focused on in place of increasing participation. We see that millions of dollars continue to go in supporting athlete development. We saw 117 million poured into Own the Podium, and we continuously see that all of our money is going into high performance sport. So I think it comes with the person who's signing off on those checks needs to be radical enough to sort of challenge the status quo of sport and recognize that we need to prioritize wellness. And hopefully someone who eventually does that recognizes that by prioritizing wellness, that becomes a prerequisite to excellence. And I think that's where this misconception is that violence is instrumental to success. But it's actually the opposite, that if we are prioritizing wellness and safety, people are going to operate a lot more efficiently and effectively within that realm. And that will lead to excellence, as we've seen in other sectors outside of sport as well. So I think we need someone outspoken and different enough to just challenge the status quo and really shake things up. I don't know if that's too idealistic. I don't know if that's achievable, but I feel like we're just reproducing these conversations that I had decades ago. And the worst thing that can happen is 10 years from now, we evaluate all these safe sport efforts and recognize that nothing's working. which we don't need to wait 10 years. We see that nothing's really working as of now.
And that's why you're all here, because you're leaders. And I know you're all seeking that big lever for change. You know, I think Laura mentioned you dive into this one area, you're trying to make change, it's not working. I've had the same thing where I think, well, if maybe I join that board, maybe I'll have an impact, and then, oh, that's not working. So where else? We're all looking, right? So being leaders, but also influencing these leaders who are in positions where they can sign off on checks or have influence. One of my teammates just became a senator. I'm hoping that might help. Christy.
Yeah, I think that's great. What I like to think about is that we need leaders who are not afraid to lose. I mean, I think that that we need to lose and be okay with losing, that we have to prioritize something beyond winning at all costs. And I think that that's as radical a sports system as we can have. And we don't see these problems, when the old men I work with, some of whom are quite old, like in their 80s, many of them played hockey at elite levels. And by the time they get to their 70s and 80s, they don't produce the same sports system they did when they were even 10 years younger. Old timers hockey does produce that same kind of elitist sports system. But these community-based, non-competitive, they don't keep score. They find ways of producing really beautifully inclusive sports systems where people with dementia, with Parkinson's, can play, that they understand that their time in the sport might be limited and they want to extend it as long as possible. And so they create opportunities for their colleagues, for their teammates to do the same. But you can't have that if your focus is just on winning. And national sport, George Orwell was talking about this, and during World War II, national sports systems are always about winning, that it's about representing the nation in a particular way. It's about saying something about what it means to be Canadian. And I think that that's the mindset we need to change, that we can be Canadian and be really proud if we produce a sports system that makes us feel proud. But to do that, we kind of have to be okay with losing. Like to me, that's the radical step, is to just be okay with not being the best.
What is
I mean, in theory, I think, yeah, but in practice, I mean, if you look at the vocation of sport, and let's take the key, one of the key roles of coaching, for example, like in high performance, I mean, they're rewarded for their outcomes, and these people butter their bread. This is what they do, when they're paid to perform. So asking them to lose is a drastic shift to be okay with. I'm not disagreeing. I in fact quite agree with you that it is a philosophical shift we're asking. That's the real challenge, I think, is like allowing people to be okay, but still like celebrating the environment that's created, and not so much celebrating the outcomes. Like part of culture, part of what research on culture teaches us is that when you're reinforcing things, like through ceremony and celebration and achievement and all these sorts of things, you're constantly reinforcing the message. But if you look to what we celebrate in Canada, we don't celebrate the process. We don't celebrate the development of people. We don't even look at that because it's not sensational. It's not interesting. And so the narrative, I think, is a big narrative to try to change. I'm not suggesting I have an answer to it, but if you're looking at culturally reinforcing mechanisms, we also have to talk about what we're celebrating in sport, how we celebrate it. And there's lots to that. Sorry, Jennifer.
No, and what do we actually value in Canada? And I've been reflecting on this a little bit lately, that I think we actually are violent. And we are actually great bystanders. It's polite group thinkers, polite to the point where we sacrifice principle for the sake of this kind of harmony across the group, and leads us to be secretive. I think we need to call that out in our culture, in our cultural values in Canada, and question it more. But also diffuse some of the negative with something that is working, like Christy's pointing out. We do have models and examples and values that can balance, like Eric, your work around too much of a good thing, and needs a balance of something that can counteract. So winning, is fun, but you can't hate losing that much that winning becomes everything. I mean, you can't hate losing. Losing's cool. You learn a lot from it, and someone has to, right? So how do we bring in something or build up what we do well in Canada and value that's helpful to diffuse some of this more destructive values?
I mean, we can't ignore the fact that sport has to be funded somehow in some way. And you know, like hockey's one of the sports that is lucky enough to have corporate funders, you know, and big broadcasting and what have you. But look what that's done. You know, as soon as the purse string gets pulled, change happens. You know, and you just have to wonder, like, is there better ways that we can look at a system that still requires money, you know, to celebrate excellence in a different way?
Yeah, make it cool to be.
But I think that, you know, big issue around having the leadership to be able to do that is so critical. And I think Joseph's ideas around having that radical leadership is critical. But one thing that I think we're kind of talking about is as if we're only talking about it within Canada, right? Like we're only can shift the needle on what we do and excellence as if that's Canada that's looking at it. But we don't do that. We look outward. We compare ourselves on a constant basis globally from the sporting landscape. And then the practices and the rituals that we take from those performative elements. So whether that be major games where we're winning medals, or the rituals that happen at those games and those events that we then bring down to our grassroots level and expect our kids to be doing the same types of ceremonies and rituals, all is about building this sense of excellence in comparison to others, whether that be other individuals, teams, and other nations. And so it would take a massive step towards a radical shift in thinking about moving that needle of excellence to look at something different. I think that's a really fundamental piece that we can't forget, that it's not just us shifting ourselves within Canada and we'll be okay. Because there's countries that have done some of that work, and Joseph commented on some of that work has been done elsewhere, and yet they're experiencing many of the similar types of issues that we are, even with those radical shifts. So, you know, I think there's still a lot to be understood and to be done. And yeah, so I just think there's that. And I mean, Eric's comment about the funding piece, I think we should talk a bit more about that, because we know that there's been shifts. When sport funding and accountability framework came out, you know, that was initially supposed to be the marker of making sure sport organizations were accountable, had the right policies in place, procedures, mechanisms, and that has failed miserably. So there has to be something else, other mechanisms in place if we're going to see some real change.
Yeah, so much optics, not enough actual ethics, and we reward rather than resource, hey, and actually develop. So back to Eric's point about where are we focusing on actually the development of these people and achieve, and you know, it's not about a medal either. Standards of excellence of all kinds. What's working at grassroots in terms of where we're resourcing something well, whether it's, I mean, it's not always money, right? But it can be time and energy and care. What's working to, like, I'm thinking, for instance, of a little basketball league, little grade 3s, and we do this thing where it's very structured and it's equal playing time, but you just like put on a shift of 4 kids and they line up at the end of the bench and the next 4 on. You can't pick and choose. There's nothing, there's no score posted. It's just let's play and try and get the ball in the basket and apply some of the things hopefully that we've taught you. But you know, it's just very structured that way, and it makes everybody just kind of chill out and relax because there's no scoreboard to look at, and these kids are just kind of going in. It's hilarious. What else is working like that?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, Jennifer, about some of the types of programs, particularly that I'm involved with parasport programming. You know, anybody can play, anybody wants to come out and try things out and do things. And often there's no scoring. Rules are sort of, because that's the other thing, sport would love to adhere to rules and practices. And we kind of just throw those out, whatever works for you, or however you can emulate or are mobile in this particular environment, that's great. And it works. And we have really fun sport. Lots of people might come out and say, well, you're just playing, it's just recreation.
Mm.
And so I think that's a really interesting distinction. You know, again, I go back, I'm a policy person, I love that. We made this distinction in the 70s that there is recreational and there is sport. So there's recreational, so whenever they don't actually meet. But the reality is, we know we all go out and we play and we have fun, and I don't care whether I define that as recreation or it's sport. I'm having a good time. I'm with others. I'm enjoying myself. I don't know whether I'm keeping score or time, whatever. So I think those are really fundamental things that are happening. But I think within the system, there isn't an acknowledgement of those as being valuable sport experiences. Those are a great recreation, good physical activity, but that's not sport. And that's really the part that has to be pulled apart. Sport is so institutionalized that that's not seen as valuable.
Yeah, and it's completely teased apart from health now, too.
Right.
Christy, can you tell us more about the old man hockey and what's working there? What are the structures, mechanisms, approaches, mindsets, values?
I think they start with the makeup of the teams. So the teams are selected for for parity, so that the teams are competitive, that against one another. The people who manage the league that I studied in Peterborough spent a lot of time in Peterborough, Ontario, spent a lot of time together, kind of deciding what players, and if it becomes unbalanced, they reorder the teams to keep balance. I think part of it is the kind of the both structural and social changes of gender that happen over time, right? I mean, these players have done what they're going to do, but their health becomes profoundly important. They no longer bear the invincibility of youthfulness and are very aware that, you know, catching a blade in the ice or being cross-checked into the boards could result in never playing again and potentially more catastrophic injury. And it allows them to just a recentering of joyful fun. You know, they go out there to make sure that everybody enjoys themselves, and whether that means you know, giving a nice pass, so somebody who's never scored a goal, like that session gets a goal. Whether it's, you know, shooting onto the goalie's pads to make sure that a particularly weak goalie gets a save. They really value making sure that everybody enjoys themselves. And there's a kind of maturity to that leads to a remarkably inclusive sporting space. And I think there are lessons there. And I understand, like, it's not, I don't want to be Pollyanna. You can, like, these lessons I think are important ones, but there's something inherent about competitive men and boys hockey that they can't express this until they're done. We can look at the challenges to competitive men and boys hockey in this country that have almost exclusively come from athletes at the end of their careers, after they've retired. We've seen, you know, the class action lawsuit launched by Dan Carcillo around hazing and sexual violence. Athletes can be a lot more radical when they're out of their sport. We need to find spaces for these kinds of places for athletes themselves to be radical, to challenge the system. And it's really, really hard in a capitalist, corporate structured system where there's so much privilege and prestige placed on getting to be the best, to getting these, you know, these elusive 300 or whatever spots. And I think that we need to really think critically about how we can create those spaces. And I think Eric has.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it just occurred to me when you were saying, like, one of the key things I think is happening in a lot of team sports is that people want to feel like they belong to that team. And right. And so if you have this like sort of backdrop of importance of fit and belonging, you know, kind of that feeling of being part of something, if you see something wrong, you don't want to jeopardize that necessarily. And so what we're seeing, I think, with the Dan Carcillo piece is, you know, his career's over. So he's going to say something now. He's not a part of that team or that instrument of hockey anymore. And so it's okay to say, well, it's okay. Like, the fact that it's okay now is actually a step in the right direction, isn't it? You know, because it may not have even have been okay after someone's playing career 15 years ago. So I guess that in some ways progress. But I think what we're seeing, though, is this domination of values gone astray because people don't feel like they can speak up necessarily. They have to be awfully brave and counter towards the team once again. And so how do we create spaces where that's embraced? you know.
Yeah. Leadership and a lot of, and unfortunately in some sports, of course, the veterans end up kind of dominating the rookies instead, and there's this hierarchy instead of the leaders being the facilitative, communicative, principled individuals within the space who do call out something that's contradictory to what we've agreed we value. And this comes back to coaching education, right? Helping them understand this is really where you're going to get the greatest benefits, that violence actually isn't necessary to performance. That this is great. It's really multi-pronged, isn't it? I want to come back to safety for sure, what it is, why it's so necessary, but also para as another example. I almost feel like I've had a couple of students focusing on para sport, and we've concluded, really para is the model because it normalizes inclusion, diversity, access. That should be the norm for any activity, human activity, hey, but it's gradually gaining ground and prominence. I know we have these debates about should there be a Paralympics, but I kind of think so, because at least it draws attention and showcases these beautiful values. What do you think, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we could have a whole seminar on that in and of itself, right? So, and debate some of those concepts. But I think the foundational pieces around opportunity and inclusion are what makes para so important, and is bringing a different set of values initially to the forefront. Where I think we begin to go wrong, and it's not wrong, astray, is we have embedded within that the sort of excellence mindset, right? And so again, para is supported and funded fundamentally on the same model as non-disabled sports. So as you move up, that chain towards excellence, you move more and more towards those values of excellence, winning at all costs. And so safety becomes a whole other piece. The other piece I think you have to recognize is safety can mean a very different thing in the space of para for those who don't necessarily have access and opportunity and move and ambulate in the same way that many of us do. And so we need to think about what that really means for people to feel safe and belong in sporting spaces. And I think that's an area that I'm hearing a lot from the participants in my studies about systems and structures. So those institutions of sport don't recognize, and they use some philosophy perspectives that look at recognition, don't recognize me and my needs as an individual. And so that is where sport is sort of this structure, this really institutionalized framework of sport kind of butts up against what para is trying to develop and could be developing. So I think that we have to be careful about thinking, oh, this is this great space, because there is some serious tension happening there.
Tension. And we keep kind of hitting back to this hyperfixation on excellence, that really being at the root, because then it creates these structures, it creates these mindsets, it creates these mechanisms. People ignore policy, like it starts to bleed out right into across the system. And so how do we counteract? I mean, this comes back to Eric's work. How do we counteract or mute it a little bit or mediate it somehow?
Yeah, I mean, I think Eric can speak to that, because I know some of his participants in his study have been from parasport, and those are the values that are coming forward are quite interesting in some of the work that I've seen him talk about.
All right, had myself on mute there. This is a monumentally important task, because we have to reconcile what we reward in sport. And it's counterintuitive at the moment, based on everything we know and what we've heard and discussed today. What we're celebrating is fundamentally causing the issues that we're experiencing. I saw earlier in the chat, I don't know who said it, and I was trying to follow along about some of the other areas in the world that may look at sport differently and yet still achieve excellence. And I think someone made the comment of Norway, actually, if I remember it correctly. We should be learning from other countries and looking to see what they're achievements are and how they go about sport. And we shouldn't always speak to hockey either, because I feel like hockey is kind of the hot button issue in our country, but there's other sports that we should be learning from. And the first one that comes to mind, rightly or wrongly for me, is swimming. And the women's swim program, for example, like, I mean, they're killing it. They're crushing it. What is it that they're doing that's so great? I'd love to find out. I'd love to get some research into the perspective of how we're developing excellence in these other sports that may not get the same rewards as other sports, and yet they're still doing so great. Like, we need to learn from these other sports and
doing great in terms of performance, but also healthy, intact, friends, still happy, expanding that frame of what do we mean by these standards of excellence. We used to call it a gold medal standard in rowing, and the gold medal kind of became irrelevant in so many different ways, and not just on the water, but off the water. What kind of standards of excellence are you upholding as a leader, as a community member? So crucial. How do we expand our frame a little more too?
And I'm not to say that I'm an insider in swimming. I don't mean to make that the case, because there may be very well problems in that sport, as I'm sure there is across other sports as well. But I think the conversation that we tend to have most of the time is around what's wrong with sport.
So what's working? Yeah, let's keep talking about that. I loved speaking with Mark Schreiber, so the high performance director, and sorry, it's high performance, but in speed skating, very much a partnership model, really collaborative, the athletes working with all staff toward goals that they have. But why can't we replicate that little model right across the sport realm, so that it's always this kind of partnership? What do we want out of this? When they're little, like it's LTID in a way, but when they're little, when we're trying to help them feel like they belong, new Canadians, what are we actually trying to achieve? What is our standard of excellence here? It's not always winning. Takes leadership. All right, where else could we be influencing leadership? Just to wrap up, we have about 10 more minutes, but where else do you think these levers for change are? Where are the leaders that we're noticing emerge? And then let's come back and finish off with safety.
I want to put Joseph on the spot, if I may. You said something at the conference that still sticks with me, and it's the idea of inclusion in sport. And I think you may have done some work in this space and came out with this comment. And I was thinking to myself, like, how we value inclusion, and it becomes very central to what we talk about. And yet there's a lot of people that don't feel that that's actually happening. And it occurred to me that we're like, oh, look at inclusion's on the website, and we value inclusion because it's part of our policy. But are we actually experiencing this in sport? I'd like to put you on the spot. Hear what you have to say.
Yeah, sure. I think the whole conversation around inclusion, and by extension equity and diversity, has been interesting. I think it's another, hot topic in light of recent events that people have jumped on the bandwagon as being hyper focused on. Not to say it's not important, but I think the approach to inclusion, and one of my criticisms in my work has been around the fact that we have this one size fits all approach to inclusion, assuming that everyone experiences inclusion in sport similarly. That takes away the ability to recognize and celebrate the nuanced differences and the distinct values that different cultural groups share across Canada, Canada being a very multicultural nation, right? And so when we talk about inclusion of who exactly? Because the way we talk about inclusion of, let's say, the quote unquote typical Canadian may look very different for someone who identifies as being Indigenous, right? And so I look at examples of, and I resort back to the Indigenous examples because I feel like it's a great context to understand how poorly we've advanced inclusionary efforts in Canada. When we look at the calls to action, how NSOs have failed to advance the calls to action to make sport, or to decolonize sport, or at least indigenize it. We see with the marginal focus on policy, we see the fact that most sport sectors don't integrate any spiritual piece, which is part of that medicine wheel model of wellness, which I understand is very much a focus of Prairie First Nation groups, but nonetheless very reflective still of the belief system across several Indigenous populations. And so that's been the concern around inclusion, at least for me, in the context of safe sport and our conversations around this shift in culture, is that this one size fits all approach doesn't really lead to the inclusion of anyone based on these assumptions that we all need to be included, in similar ways, where there are distinct needs and there are distinct interests and values that need to be further considered within the context of sport, which isn't the case, at least in what my research would suggest at the moment.
So we seem so incapable of embracing diversity, and yet, again, our very survival hinges on it. We are so diverse in Canada. It's staring us in the face, and yet there's such a reluctance, eh? I mean, as human beings in general, but yeah.
I would further, sorry, go ahead, just.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking, I further that, and I often talk with my students about that, as what does inclusion really mean in sport? Because sport by its very nature is exclusive. The way it's structured, the way we put rules around it, the way we select particular participants who have particular qualities. I mean, the whole nature of what sport is now institutionalized as is inherently exclusive. And so I think we should think about the language we use when we're talking about those who we are wanting to welcome into and feel belong in sport, because I don't know that inclusion is really fundamental to what we're talking about. I don't actually like to use that word, and I try not to use that word in my own work, because I don't think that's actually what we're saying. I think we're talking about creating safe, welcoming environments where people can feel that they can self-determine their own level of participation and interaction. But I don't think that's inclusive necessarily.
So back to this idea of creating a safe environment. Talk a little bit more about that, and it being welcoming, allowing people to choose where they belong, where they could fit, where they could find something. Eric?
Well, I was just going to pick up on what Joseph and Laura were saying. Is, my take on it is what I'm seeing with a lot of organizational espoused values is the word inclusion. And what I'm hearing is maybe that word isn't being used in the manner, or understood in the manner by which it needs to be. And so if we're talking about shifting a culture and we're using words incorrectly, or emphasizing things in a manner that is counterintuitive to their actual meaning, once again, we have a larger problem we have to deal with in terms of whether or not we're actually going to shift anything to begin with. And again, back to one of the comments in the chat too, and I want to, thank the person for this, is that, we're not talking about these things. We're not sharing best practices to the extent that maybe we need to across the sports sector. And that, again, is not helping solve a long-standing issue, right? We're speaking in silos and echo chambers.
Yes, and checking boxes and optics and just swirling around, having the same conversations instead of being very intentional, which I feel like is really emerging from this conversation. Some intentional avenues to pursue around language, around learning, sharing. So if we do have a conference, to actually intentionally try to learn, invite in other things that are working. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, Eric, I think you make a really good point. We're not sharing best practices, and I think it speaks to the fragmented system of sport in Canada. And specifically, we see this very disjointed system specifically around safe sport, and the fact that the way it's conceptualized, the way that it's implemented, the way it's discussed is very different from sport to sport, from level of sport to level of sport, province to province, and territory, and so forth. And I think it speaks to the importance of conversations now looking towards standardizing this space, so that we have this systematic alignment, so that we can actually share best practices, as opposed to there being organizations competing for clout because, you know, they created this training or they created this policy and it's better than this or that. We're all universally trying to achieve the same outcome and objective in sport. These, you know, different purposes I hear everyone speaking about today, that sport is, you know, a space that's diverse and welcome and accessible, stems from us all implementing very similar practices and conceptualizing this space similarly, which I don't see that coherence across our sport system. That fragmented approach has really led to safe sport being a very broken and ineffective space where people like to talk about it and they like the fact that it's the buzzword and it's the hot topic now, but it's only for a time being until, you know, what we see, the cyclical pattern, it dies down and then all of a sudden the next scandal happens and the person, you know, next to you says, hey, have you heard of safe sport and the importance of athlete rights? And we have this conversation all over again. So that fragmented system, we need to look at how we can standardize the system. So we have these consistent best practices that are applicable across every level of sport and across every sport as well. At the end of the day, violence here where I am in Ontario is the same as, you know, how violence should be conceptualized, you know, out west or out east. And we see that in other sectors outside of sport. So I don't know why we have this fragmented system. I assume it comes down to a lack of professionalization around this space of safe sport. And I question whether professionalization would lead to a bit more standardized system, but to be determined, I guess.
Yeah, and I think sport suffers from a very kind of primordial, very basic conceptualization of competition too, and that kind of keeps us all fragmented and separate and secretive, instead of overriding that to understand first we have to start by a shared vision of a coherent vision for Canadian sport, and then allow for all the diverse expressions of that. It's a tolerance of two things at once, right? Which we can do in sport, we're good at, but yeah, we really seem to be struggling. So I feel like we've all concluded that nothing's working right now, but there are some great opportunities to press our leaders, but also be leaders to try to build intentional spaces where we can all come together and share good practices and continue to problem solve. I just want to give Christy the last word before we wrap up, because we haven't heard from her in a minute. What do you think?
Yes, go ahead, Christy. Final comments, please.
Oh, goodness. I have no idea. I mean, I think,
What do you think?
yeah, there's lots of room for sport to get better. I think maybe that's where we should start. We can only go up from here.
Right, and we love that as athletes, as sport participants, we love that idea of striving. So let's strive together, but let's figure out where we're heading first. Thank you all so much for the amazing conversation. Really great to meet you all in more depth. And I just felt like we should probably have dinner together and dig into it a little bit more. And thanks for everybody else. Kim, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think there'll be a lot of participants who would like to join you on that dinner. There's been some very active conversation. I've been recording plenty of the comments. I'm happy to forward those to you if you'd like to see. Really great personal reflections from some of our attendees, just on their own childhoods, on being parents, or just participating in their own sports. Emotional and psychological safety, discussions on inclusion, performative and practical DEI type of policy, and really shifting those policies at the grassroots. So great discussions. Thank you everyone for participating in today. We do have next up, we're going to have a break for 30 minutes for lunch. We'll be, or a little longer than that, I suppose. We'll be back at 2 o'clock, and we're going to be listening to For the Land for the Future, Critical Positionality for Anti-Oppressive Knowledge Mobilization. So please don't go too far. Please come back at 2 o'clock and we'll see you shortly. Thank you, Jennifer, and all of our panelists today.